Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the village's second and final public meeting on our vulnerability assessment. The vulnerability assessment is it's a high-level sea level rise and flood planning project, essentially. So the village is taking proactive steps to address the concerns
and
and
threats
threats
that are going to happen or already happening with sea level rise and flooding.
We are about
a year and a half into the project.
I do that.
I don't think so.
All right, so we are about a year and a half into this project. The Village Council approved this project. That was back in August 2022. So we are wrapping up this project. And what we are doing today, we have consultants with us. These are our fine consultants, Aaron Deedy and Alex Zelensky. We're going to be giving a presentation showing the results of this analysis, some interesting maps of the modeling, all the different projections of the sea level rise and flood scenarios and the critical assets within the village that may or may not be impacted by sea level rise and flooding. This project was 100% funded through a grant from the DEP through the Resilient Florida Project. And the format for this, we're going to give the presentation. Aaron and Alex are going to give a presentation, maybe a half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. This is meant to be interactive. Are there any questions or comments from those in the audience? Please feel free to ask questions. And then any attending on Zoom, we'll do the same for those on Zoom after those in attendance. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody for being here and participating online tonight. One thing in this presentation is we're gonna attempt to have some interactive technology with some online questions. So you might want to get out your phone. We have ways that you can take a screenshot or a camera shot of a screenshot or a camera shot of the. Okay, great. A screenshot or a camera shot of a question, and we'll have some live polling. So we'd like to hear from you tonight on a couple of those items. So you can either open the tool, it's called Mentimeter, in another browser, or you can camera shot it through your phone and participate that way. So we look forward to your participation, and we appreciate being here tonight. So just quickly, team introductions. There are 3 firms that are working on this project. My firm, Aaron L. Deedy, PA, we're located in Delray Beach. Clearview Geographic is responsible for most of the technical work and the modeling. And WSP is also working on this project, helping with the project development and the ultimate recommendations that are coming out of the vulnerability assessment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project and its objectives. It's been about 8 months since we've been in front of you related to this project. So we want to update you on the modeling output and some of the example adaptation recommendations that we're going to make. And then we're going to talk about where we are going next with this project. And so here quickly, just the 3 firms that I mentioned that are working on the project. Oh, I'm not sharing. Okay, I thought I was. I apologize. I thought I was doing it. How about now? Okay. There we go. I apologize for that. So there we go. Technology problem solved. So talking about the project objectives, we are evaluating risk, and the state of Florida largely provides a program for us to evaluate flood risk, and they prescribe certain scenarios that we're going to talk about. We are measuring the impacts from those various flood scenario risks and understanding the magnitude. The issue is, an asset that the village owns and maintains and thinks is really important. It may flood, but we need to understand how important that asset is. For instance, if it's a tiki hut in somebody's backyard or a picnic pavilion at a park, that may not be a big deal. But if it's a lift station or a drainage pump or something that people rely upon, that may be a big deal. So we want to understand the magnitude of that risk and how it relates to the various assets that the community owns and maintains. And again, one of the biggest things that is an objective of this project is to identify actions and strategies so you can position yourself for further grant
funds. There are available state and federal granting funds, and you've already been able to secure some of the funding for various adaptation projects, and this plan will set you up for more of that. And so these are the types of flooding risks that the state of Florida wants us to look at. It's not just about sea level rise. It's about high tide flooding events, king tide events in October. It's about storm surge flooding, rainfall flooding. And we also combine some of these scenarios in what I call the mashup of compound flooding, which is all of the above in one type of event. And that's not a far-fetched thing that could happen. You could get an October king tide, a 100-year rainfall event, and an offshore storm that could produce some level of surge or wind. And you could have these combined events that could exacerbate one another and create more impact to the community. One thing that this project is, this is not about mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions or the causes of climate change. This is really about adaptation. Knowing that the impacts are going to occur, modeling various flood scenarios, and then what do we do about it? And so there are only so many things that you can do from a capital project perspective. You can relocate assets, you can harden assets and make them more resilient to the impacts of flooding, or you can update codes and policies. So when somebody comes in and, for instance, they put in a new seawall, or you put in a new breakwater, or people build a modification to their home, there are policies that you can implement to make sure that that project is more resilient. And then part of what this project will do is help make investment decisions. In certain areas, it just may not make sense to undertake adaptation projects because the land elevation may be extremely low, and it may be subject to impact now and going to be subject to further impact in the future. So what does retreat look like, and what are the investment decisions that the village may need to make? And that's one of the harder policy discussions that may come out of some of this work. So we've collected a lot of data. We've identified gaps in that data. We've conducted an exposure analysis to look at various flood scenarios. We have identified critical assets as opposed to all of your assets. We have started to prioritize those in what we call flooding hotspots. And now we are at the point right now where we are developing final recommendations and the final report and map series for the project. So vulnerability assessments are not done in a vacuum. The state of Florida has certain requirements under their statutes. So it's not discretionary in how we approach or conduct this vulnerability assessment, which is kind of nice for the state because that means everybody is looking at the same type of scenarios and the same type of sea level rise projections. So they want us to use good elevation data, which the village has secured very good mobile LiDAR elevation data to be able to conduct these types of analyses. They want us to look at the sea level rise projections for the NOAA intermediate low and high condition for 2040 and 2070. We also model the 2100 condition because sometimes infrastructure decisions and investments are longer term than just 2040 or 2070. So we also evaluate that 2100 condition. We look at various storm surge events, and then we look at rainfall, plus these different compound flooding events together. And generally, we're looking at the 100-year and the 500-year storm event. So one of the first things that we did in this project, and one of the longest things that it always takes to do in a vulnerability assessment, is find out what we're working with, find out what you have. The state of Florida wants us to look at 4 different types of what they call asset classes: transportation, critical infrastructure, that's all your water, wastewater utilities, electric utilities, and some of that we know the village does not own and control. It's FKAA or FKEC, but we still have to collect that information because the community relies on the functionality of those assets. We look at critical community and emergency facilities like shelters, the village buildings, emergency management services, those types of things, and healthcare facilities. Even though that's not something that a government owns and controls, the community relies upon it, and you definitely want to know if it's subject to flood risk or not. And then the final category is natural, cultural, and historic resources. We look at shorelines, conservation lands, parks, and historic structures. We also collect that data from the state. And so what the state wants us to do is take all of that asset data and run various flood scenarios on it and look at how those assets are going to be impacted in the future. And then we identify adaptation strategies, what to do about it. We have had now, this is our second public meeting, and then we will be working on finalizing the priority projects for potentially moving forward. The village can fund and implement or seek grants to fund those projects. So now we're getting to some of the more interactive part of this. We're going to use a tool called menti.com. You can log on to that browser, or with each of the questions, I'm going to have a little scan and you can take a picture of that scan with your phone and it'll take you right to the question if you don't even want to log in. And here is our first question. Why do you think a vulnerability assessment is important? And this is a free open response question. You can type in anything you want, and then you hit the submit button there, and we'll start to get people's thoughts on why a vulnerability assessment would be important. We'll leave this up for a couple of seconds for people to start populating. I'm going to put something in there just to make sure it's working right. Cool. All right. And we can compile those results and get them back to you. All right, so we are at elevation 3. Somebody put up there. Decisions, protection, our future, development, evacuation, resilience, community. All right, so now that was kind of our test question. We'll have a couple of other ones where you can kind of provide more input into the types of strategies and where you think the village should go with some of this. Thank you. And God willing, the technology works. Okay, great. So one of the things that the state asks us to do is look at the days of tidal flooding. And they have certain standards that they want us to look at the nearest NOAA tide gauge, which we do. And then they want us to account for the highest high tide of the year. They want us to look at the highest high tide, and that is not 2 feet. That is whatever the highest high tide comes out to be. Turn on your mic.
So that's the highest astronomical tide and king tide there. But the days of tidal flooding mapping accounts for basically the variation of water throughout the year. Obviously, you have your high tides and low tides. And as we scroll through these map series, you'll see everything from, I think, 150 days plus of flooding down to a day of flooding. And that captures the lowest tides and the highest tides throughout that particular year.
So we take those tidal depths and then we add to them 2040, 2070, and 2100 of sea level rise. So on this map, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, the greens, that's where you see a higher number of days. Now, what's interesting on this particular map is a lot of what's red there is already low lying and already tidally influenced anyway. A lot of this is not more water on tops of people's homes or on top of property. It's already kind of reflecting what we know. But then you start to see the transition with 2070, you see more of those higher numbers of days creeping into spaces that are not just mangroves and tidally influenced land that's undeveloped that we already know is impacted by some level of tide flooding. And then finally by 2100, again, we're seeing more of those impacts with the red being the highest number of days that we'll see some type of inundation at that level of tide flooding. And so that's the first map series that the state wants us to compile, is that days of tidal flooding. Then we look at sea level rise plus a high tide threshold that the state wants us to use. They prescribe it to us. It's 2 feet of high tide. That's their way of saying, we know that we're going to be impacted by sea level rise, but we need to account for some level of tidal flooding. And so this is the NOAA intermediate sea level rise condition with that high tide flooding. And you see the depth there, 0 to 6 inches, 6 inches to 1 foot. It is 31.2 total inches of sea level rise for 2040, 54.36 inches of total rise for 2070. And you see more of the darker shades, which is the higher levels of inundation and depth. And then finally, you see the 2100 condition there, which contemplates 88.2 total inches of sea level rise. And you can see, where that water is creeping more onto shore and more in the developed areas, and where there's going to be more permanent inundation. Now, the one thing that I should note with our modeling and our evaluation, this does not account for the management of your stormwater system. You do have stormwater structures, you do have seawalls, you do have shorelines, which are going to mitigate some of this impact. And so our model strictly looks at elevations of the land and elevation of water. So for that reason, it's a pretty conservative estimate of where the inundation or where the flooding is going to go on the land. The village is about to launch a process where it's going to do some more advanced modeling to look at those stormwater operations. But for now, this evaluation is just strictly looking at the elevation of the land and the water in that interface. So then we look at rainfall. As anybody may know, in Florida, we are getting more high volume, unusual season rain events at different times of the year. I think it was 2 weekends. It was President's Day weekend. We had major rain event. I remember we had to call our camping trip a day short. We were flooded out, but that is unusual for February to see that type of a rain event. Last November, if any of us went to the Southeast Florida Climate Compact Conference in Miami Beach, there was serious flooding and rainfall that was going on there, which is a little late in the season to have those events as well. So we do know that looking at rainfall conditions is a really important thing to do, because we know that in the future, those rainfall events are going to have more precipitation associated with them. So this is the 2040 scenario. In the purple there, you see the actual rainfall precipitation. And then that's 16.1 inches for a 100-year storm event. And the blue there is where you can see the sea level rise on top of those rainfall events, and how you can see the different types of flooding inundation that's going to occur. Where you see the darker blue events starting to creep in, you're seeing more of that sea level rise impact, and the darker the purple, you're seeing more of that rainfall impact. But the two are going to become more pronounced over time. And so you move through the 2070 and the 2100 condition. Again, you are adding those sea level rise depths with the 100-year rainfall depths. And so it's going to have an exacerbated impact on the land. Sea level rise plus storm surge. Now, we all, know what it's like to be in a hurricane, especially in the Keys. The surge comes and it goes. That makes it no less impactful, but it's not one of those conditions that's more permanent, like sea level rise or this tidal flooding or the increased rainfall that we're seeing. But you still need to know, and we do know that communities across Florida are pretty used to planning for storm surge events. But what we're looking at here is how storm surge events are going to be impacted by more sea level rise. So this is, again, the 2040 NOAA intermediate high sea level rise condition, plus a storm surge event, a 100-year storm surge event. And that rise is 129.2 inches. With 2070, it's 152.4 inches. And then with 2100, it's 186. And so those greens and those lighter areas and yellow and orange, those are less impacted. The reds are more impacted. And then finally, this is what I call that mashup scenario where we're looking at sea level rise plus high tide, plus a surge event, plus rainfall on top of it. And you have the statistics there about how much of the rise of the rainfall and the different conditions are. The purples and the deeper reds and oranges are the bigger depths of flooding inundation that we're looking at. The blue is the lighter. And you can see how that gets impacted over time in the 2100 condition. It looks much like the previous map series because surge is really the big factor here when you look at these combined events. And so we have our next Mentimeter question, which is trying to gauge people's views on how important investing in resiliency is. And so this is a 100-point scale, and you can allocate your 100 points across the 3 questions there about whether or not investing in resiliency is a very high priority or should be a high priority. Looking at nature-based strategies or nature-based resilient strategies is important, or investing in resilient infrastructure is really important. And this is where we're really trying to gauge people's views. Do we focus more on things like living shorelines and nature-based solutions where we're letting nature kind of fight some of these high tide flooding events? Or are we really prioritizing and jumping towards drainage and seawalls and harder kind of infrastructure components? Is it working? Oh, there we go. Cool. Yes.
Work on the status or drawing information for baseline flood evaluation. The NGV, we had a station in Key West and the Everglades at one time and all got confused with another that had been formally used.
Absolutely, that's a great question. We use NAVD, elevation NAVD. We're using the Key West tide gauge because it has a 100-year period of record. The state of Florida would like us to use NOAA tide gauges, and they actually have a list of those NOAA tide gauges. They would like you to average between the 2 closest tide gauges, but you can use just one tide gauge if it has the higher of the 2 estimates. And then for the surge, we use the most recent
Flood insurance study
flood insurance study.
and the still water elevations in that study.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Remind us, could you define that? Okay, but I used to work with it.
Ye-
But a lot of people may not be familiar with it.
So
Sure.
LiDAR is light detection and ranging. It's an acronym, but basically high accuracy elevation data. It creates kind of a 3D surface that or a 3D surface of Islamorada. And that's referenced to that NAVD 88, and that's an elevation benchmark. And using the tide gauges and other data available, we're able to point to where that water is in Islamorada.
It's also involved now.
Yes.
Does that answer your question? Great, thank you.
Okay, future questions, just come up to the mic so we get it on, get it on camera too. So no, that was good questions though. So I hope that was captured. Thank you.
All right, so the results are in on this question, and we will include these results in the final report. Appreciate your feedback. So now we're going to transition after we've done this exposure modeling and looked at the various flood scenarios. What do we do about it? And so one of the first things we do about it is to establish what we call flooding hotspots. Some people may call them focus areas or prioritize areas. We try to keep the language simple on this. A hotspot is an area that's going to be subject to some type of flooding in that area. And to define a hotspot, we look at a couple of different things. One, we look at a place where you have a lot of assets. If it's an area where you don't have a lot of assets, it's probably not that important to prioritize. So we're trying to prioritize areas where you got a lot of stuff that's at risk. Secondly, it is an area that's going to be subject to some level of flood risk. And we try to define what that flood risk is, whether it's near term or long term. And we try to color code that and identify what that flood risk is. And then we've also ground truth to the extent that we can, these hot spots with the village staff, with looking at other storm event data to make sure that what has actually happened on the ground or what we expect to happen is coming out of this analysis, and that there is some level of truth comparison that we make sure that we get the right flooding hotspots. Next, within those hotspots, we look at all of the assets that are contained within them. And we ultimately will assign a ranking to those assets of 1 through 5. And so this is kind of a formulaic way that we weight the various types of flood risk associated with the asset. And then we try to define the percentage of the assets. Like, for instance, the top 5% of the assets are the most important, so they're going to get a number 1 ranking. And then we have percentage ranges from there. If the assets were not flooded significantly and they don't score high, we're not going to kind of carry them forward in our analysis and in our mapping, but we do know all of the assets within the village and how they're scored overall. Sure.
Come up.
Jerry O'Cathy, concerned citizen. Do you have access to the Monroe County Critical Facility Inventory? And do you access that and evaluate that? And secondly, these hotspots, what area do they comprise?
Sure, I can flip back. I've got a map series. I think we've got one of our boards here that defines where all of the hotspots are. And yes, Monroe County is conducting a vulnerability assessment at the same time as this one. And we've looked at their asset data. We've looked at the village asset data. We've looked at county assets contained within the village, other state agency and federal agency assets. We've looked at Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, FKEC. We've also pulled from state asset databases and federal asset databases. Well, FKEC, I mean,
Concern in the past with water power light and water encroachment, saltwater intrusion and cooling canals, and that on the plant's output.
oh, you mean at Turkey Point? Okay, so the extent of this study is just within the village of Islamorada. Sure. And so here's how it shakes out. So to kind of further answer your question, what did we look at? We looked at 3,151 different assets from all of those databases. After we scored them, 555 of those assets were either ranked 1, 2, or 3, meaning the highest priority for looking at for future adaptation. 1,297 were prioritized 4 or 5. And then 1,854 assets were not prioritized because they weren't triggered by some level of flood risk. And so now what we have is kind of a list of what we need to tackle with all of these different assets that we looked at. And so I'm just going to give some examples. Here are 2 of the hotspots. This is hotspot number 1. And when we take all of this information and the scoring and we translate it and put it onto a map, those 1 through 5 rankings are shown through a circle over the asset. It's either red, orange, yellow, green, or blue. And red is number 1, orange is number 2, yellow is number 3. And you will start to see where those assets are circled on these maps. We also place the score through this scoring process of the number 1 ranked assets, the red ones. If we put the scores through assets 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, all you'd be doing is looking at a map full of numbers. So we wanted to kind of whittle that down and only reflect the scores on the maps of the top highest priority assets. But we have a very extensive spreadsheet that still ranks and shows the scores of all of the assets that we collected overall. So we're finishing up this map series right now on the prioritized assets. And what this helps do is drill down as to what we need to do with those highest priority assets. And then this is the site where we're sitting right now. This is hotspot number 2, and it shows the assets that are contained within that hotspot as well. And so the other thing that we did was we looked at where we saw flooding in Hurricane Irma. And the nice thing is our independent analysis aligns those prioritized hotspots with where you saw the worst flooding during Hurricane Irma. So what this allowed us to do is kind of independently check that we are looking at the worst flooded areas during a storm event and that we are capturing the right assets as the highest priorities. So we don't have that in every community. We don't have the ability to do that in every community to go ahead and, do some type of cross check, but we did here. And so this is just an example of where you see our assets aligning with some of those flooded areas. And so what are we going to do about it? So this is a deeper dive into hotspot number 1, that map that I showed. So stormwater infrastructure is going to be a big deal within this hotspot. And since you don't own and control the Florida Keys Electric Co-op or the FKAA assets, the best that we can do is really supply that data to those utilities and coordinate with them and say, for the purposes of Islamorada, this is where we'd like to see you focus your energies on retrofits or hardening of these utility assets. Another thing that has come up is looking at the design criteria. You've got boat owners parks and neighborhood parks. At some point, some of those may be the conduit for flooding into a neighborhood. So at some point, we're not saying that those have to be retrofitted now because you don't own and control those. But if somebody comes in and they apply for a permit to potentially redo a boat owner's park and the ramp there, you may want to have different slope criteria and different types of mitigation measures for that ramp. So it is not the source of flooding into the surrounding neighborhood. We've seen that in a couple of different communities throughout Florida where that's been a problem.
By what criteria do you determine that an asset needs to be hardened?
Well, that it's subject to some level of flood risk and that it scores pretty high in our ranking process through our scoring method. So we try to make it numerically based, and so it's not subject to some kind of subjective decision, that there is a scoring protocol for it. And so it is based on science and the flooding level and the flooding risk.
So your findings useful for mitigation grant purposes?
Yes, so the question was the findings will be useful for grant purposes. I absolutely agree that that is an objective of this and that you will essentially have ranked lists of projects and assets that need to be retrofitted. So when you're filling out a grant application, it's always nice to attach your vulnerability assessment and then show where that project has been prioritized. So yeah, sure. And so hotspot number 2, one of the solutions that we've been discussing internally is your breakwater here, looking at maybe some living shoreline features to assist with that breakwater and provide some environmental benefit and flood risk benefit at the same time. Another thing that we've looked at in certain areas is we found where there are particularly low elevations in certain neighborhoods, that may be a place to target, for instance, disaster money to help people do floodproofing and elevation of structures. So we will have some of those targeted areas. Again, you don't own and control people's individual properties, but if you have an idea of where you've got some low areas, that may help you prioritize drainage projects and potentially floodproofing and elevation. Again, looking also at elevation of shorelines, and I say elevation of shorelines because not everything is a seawall. And there may be some criteria associated with that that we can suggest about how people will potentially modify their shorelines over time when they're impacted. And again, you've got your utilities data or your utilities assets in here that we can provide that data to the utility service providers. And so now we've got another question here about the prioritization, like how should the village prioritize adaptation planning? Should the village place a higher priority on this? The village is spending the right amount of money on this, or that the village is spending too much money on this? But it's interesting to see people's perspectives on this in terms of what they think the village may be doing to start adapting and start implementing projects associated with this. So I'll leave that up for a couple of seconds and people can potentially. Ooh, we have some strong opinions on that one. All right. So here is our project timeline, and we are towards the end of the project. We had meetings with the public. It was last June, and I'm sorry, also last March, about a year ago, we were in front of the village council. We will be in front of the village council next week, and we will be presenting this information in a probably slightly shorter format. But we are moving along. This project has produced a lot of information and has digested a lot of information at the same time. And so we are in the throes of drafting the final report right now. And I just want to remind everybody that prior to this vulnerability assessment, the state of Florida has had a program called Resilient Florida, and you guys have had some success within that program to secure some funds for the breakwater and for partnership with FKAA on, I think it was some potable water mains that needed some adaptation, and you guys were the grantee on that and working with FKAA. So this is some pretty good success. Not every community in the state of Florida can say that they've gotten this level of success out of the program, and we want to continue that. And so right now, the way the statute is shaping up is that they want to see this vulnerability assessment and they want to see your projects identified in this vulnerability assessment to be eligible for that funding. They want to know that you have a plan of attack and that you have gone through this analysis to prioritize the assets and the projects that you're going to undertake. And so this sets you up to be able to do that and continue that success. And so the key takeaways, I think that the keys overall in the village of Islamorada has done a lot. And we work in communities. We were in Pensacola the beginning of this week, and we work all up and down the state of Florida, both inland and coastal communities. And I can tell you that I think that there's a lot of planning that's going on. And you've had some success in securing funding. This study is not in a vacuum. You have other work that is about to commence. For instance, your stormwater master plan is about to be updated, and there was a kickoff meeting, I believe, for a road elevation design, cost, and prioritization study that will help the village determine what roads need to be elevated and when. And that's really important because some of us were discussing prior to the presentation, without a plan of attack and without knowing the types of costs that you're looking at for these types of adaptation projects, it's really hard to start climbing that mountain. Not everything needs to be done tomorrow. You will have time on some of this stuff to make some decisions and look at different funding strategies and funding sources. But this vulnerability assessment document will help you continue down that path. And this is our last question. What types of adaptation strategies do you support? We've talked a little bit about some of those recommendations within the focus areas, living shorelines, drainage projects, building floodproofing and elevation. And I think this is an open-ended question. Yeah, so you can kind of type anything in there that you think the village should be seeing and undertaking in terms of adaptation. And I'm going to leave that one up there because for a minute, while we kind of wind up, that's one of the last slides. We do have Alex here tonight. If anybody had any specific areas that they would like to pull up, like their neighborhood, and look at a certain flood scenario, we can pull that up for you and look at that within the GIS mapping. In a presentation like this, there's only so much you can show, and we like to try to show the same spot under the various flood scenarios so you can see the different impacts. But we are happy to pull those maps up if anybody would like to look at them. We do have some poster boards around the room that we will leave with the village that you guys can use for other events, and we're going to be happy to talk to anybody and answer any questions. And yeah, so we're getting some answers in. Retreat, there we go. So we thank you. I mean, at this point, we can open it up to any other questions or conversation. Here is our contact information, and that's the end of our formal presentation, but we can take anything off of Zoom or anything here, and we've got Alex here that can pull up any of the maps that you'd like to see. Anybody?
So if anyone from the audience wants to come up and ask questions, please feel free. Now would be the time, or make a comment.
Yes, I would like to know more about detail about living shorelines, what they look like, what the features are, how they would work, that sort of thing.
So for the council presentation, maybe I'll work with Greg and get some shots, some screenshots of living shorelines just to show you and kind of what the parameters are. The point of a living shoreline is to let nature kind of fight your battles for you. And you kind of help that along by facilitating, some mangrove islands with some rocks and some breakwaters and riprap and that type of thing. But you do it to a certain elevation. Because we know in many, many areas that these living shoreline projects have really held up during high surge events. I think over in the West Coast in the Tampa Bay region, there's been a recent study where they've looked at pre and post storm, how the living shorelines held up compared to just seawalls. And they've overwhelmingly found that the living shorelines do a better job than just a flat facing seawall. So in response to that, we will add some of that into the presentation for Tuesday. Sure.
I'll just add to that, with our breakwater restoration, we are integrating mangrove planting. Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Elizabeth Jolin. So I'm curious, and maybe this is a question for Pete. What do you want to see come out of this upcoming presentation at the council meeting? Because it's a lot of information, and I'm wondering if there is a takeaway that is, clear and concise and easy to understand. And maybe we could think through that so that this is a really productive, so that you get, I don't know, so we can take next steps that make sense.
Right, that's a good point. So I think the takeaway is that while sea level rise and flooding is not right now the biggest priority in the village, right? We would have a room full of people. If it was, it will be, right? There will come a day that this is the most important topic really in the village. And when the water is coming into everyone's roads, into their houses, that's going to be the most important thing. So I think the takeaway is now is the time to start planning. It's not too soon. I think there were some really good adaptation strategies put in there here tonight, and let's start thinking about those now. And this vulnerability assessment is the building block. So this will lead into other projects. So support from the community is going to be important. That's going to be a major takeaway, and we've got to have community support for these projects. That leads into support from the village council. Of course, we need that in order to move forward. And that will help secure funding as well. So what we're looking for is essentially support. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I will also mention this is a requirement in the grant that we do this. So I mean, we would be doing this anyway. We want the public to know about this. They need to know about this. But in this DEP grant, we are required to publicly present the information.
And
For good
I
reason.
would just add one more element to this. Just because this planning grant and this planning project are coming to an end doesn't mean that you don't have further steps that you can take. One thing that communities do is they pursue what's called an adaptation plan, where you take the work and take the strategies and take the projects, and maybe you can go through some level of cost estimation and conceptual, like engineering design for those projects. So they're a little bit further along, because that's one thing that the state likes to see when you apply for grants, is that you've thought about it, that it's not just a list of a recommendation, but you've actually put some skin into the game and tried to figure out how much is that project going to cost? What is that conceptual design? How do we move forward with that project? What are the pros and cons of it, and that type of thing? So that might be something that we can suggest as well.
Yes, and just one last thing on that is the council has been supportive so far. We appreciate that, and that's evident in I'll mention the hiring of the village's first sustainability and resilience planner. So that's really interesting and exciting. So I think that shows that we're committed, and yeah, we're going to take the steps necessary to address this. Thank you.
And as far as that map review goes, I do have 96 different PDFs available with all sorts of different flood projections. And across Islamorada, I think we've got 15 pages. So if you want to walk up, I can go through any of those 96 PDFs and any of those 15 pages.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask whether the maps are going to be available to us other than at this meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that we are producing, all of the underlying information, the mapping, all of that is going to be with the village, left with the village
And
for
so
you to have within your mapping data.
we'll have it on our website.
Yes, we will make that available on our website. That's a
Soon.
good point. As soon as we're approved, wrapped up, published, delivered to DEP, we'll make it available. That's a good point.
Could we just look at a map? And the one that I thought would be interesting for me is Sea Oats Beach, mile marker 74.5. I don't know how you identify.
Floor map.
Gotcha. So for the purposes of this, I'll show NOAA intermediate high 2070 high tide or days of tidal flooding. And if you want to switch to like sea level rise or rainfall or anything like that, we are more than happy to do that. But on the screen right now, it's loading here. We have this 15-page map series. And as we scroll through, let me take some of this down.
13, 14.
13 and 14.
Between 13 and 14.
Okay.
All right. So as we scroll through, here's page 13 here. And then page 14 is right here.
This is not the one.
Yeah. All right. Give me 1 second.
Do 2040.
So sea level rise, 2040. Give me 1 second. Let's stop share. All right, so this is 2040 sea level rise with high tide flooding, and page 13 and 14. We have a couple more. Here's 13. And here is 14.
Yeah.
So that looks like the highway is the only part that's not going to be flooded. So does that reflect the fact that the highway was just elevated?
If it's captured within the LiDAR data, so it depends on the date that that was done, or the construction
It
was
was
complete.
just finished within the last 6 months.
Then no, probably not.
Obviously, the mangrove areas in dark blue there show up as pretty clearly areas that are low and subject to flooding and also clear as lower Matacumbe is pretty at risk.
See 2070?
2070?
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't, you wanna see it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, pull up 2070.
Uh, I might be able to, 1 second. Yes, that would help. Bay Ridge, okay.
Do 2070 COs first.
Yeah. So here is 2070 loading up, and then I'll scroll down to page 13 and 14. So 13's right here and 14's right here. And this is up at the top on these maps, where my cursor is right here. That's 54.36 inches of sea level rise, based on, I think it's a 2000 baseline or year 2000.
Yeah.
So where the water level was from that point, 56 inches higher puts it about here. And that's tying that back to the board that we have available in the back of the room. We're looking at the 2070 planning horizon and that upper projection there.
All right, so if you had a neighborhood,
Map 4, okay.
start with 2040.
Yep.
And just do sea level rise.
All right, so this is 2040, no intermediate high, map 4. Is this about where?
87.
So this one's just north of map 4. So maybe
Yeah.
further south of here? Okay. Here's Founders Park. Okay. And you'll notice on this map, this low-lying areas in the legend. So this is a polygon that shows, or an area marked off on the map that shows areas of similar elevation, but not necessarily tidally connected. So in this particular zone where my mouse is right now, we have this tidal inundation kind of going up to the road. And that low-lying area is similar in elevation, but there's not like a culvert or something like that in my modeling to connect those areas.
Mm, 2070 to 2070.
Are there communities that use this information to help make development approval decisions?
That's a great question. It's not required by statute. I mean, what helps you make those decisions is usually your land uses that you've designated, your zoning districts. Florida Building Code will tell you, how high you have to build and the design standards for, roads and homes and that type of thing. But that doesn't mean that the village couldn't use that information in terms of development decisions. There are ways that you can incorporate this type of information into your comprehensive plan, into design standards, into your code of ordinances. For instance, when somebody comes in and they rehab a home, or for instance, if they rehab a shoreline, maybe they have to meet different design standards to do that, considering these future conditions. So there's no requirement that this data be considered now in development decisions, but that's not to say that it could not in the future, depending on the direction that the village wants to take. I think Alex put up that same map at 2070.
Yeah. This is no intermediate high, 2070 sea level rise with high tide flooding. One thing I do want to mention, that plus high tide flooding, this is 2 feet above the mean higher high water for that particular year. And we have a slew of rainfall projections and all sorts of other things available as well. So
I'm compelled to ask you, does your information go into firm flood, the flood elevation and firm product for the count for the village?
That is a very good question too. So, FEMA has a very specific prescribed process in terms of how they develop flood projections and flood elevations that's controlled by federal law. They do that through flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance studies. We use to determine the surge elevations, the most recently adopted flood insurance study, and how FEMA, determines their regulations for flood insurance is very different than this process, and it's controlled by federal law. So I do know that there are new firms, proposed firms right now for this area. I believe that they have been appealed. I'm not sure of that. So that is a separate federally controlled process from what we are required to do through this state program.
It only seems reasonable from the layman's perspective that federally funded, results such as you're producing would be acceptable to their findings and their products.
So that's a good, that's a good point to raise. So our program is controlled by a state statute. FEMA is controlled by a certain regulatory program that is in federal law. And what they model is looking at how the waves attenuate, the bathymetric, the underwater nearshore data, how storms will move. They average, hundreds of storm events that they evaluate to determine their modeling. So they use a different set of data. Now, to the extent that we can use FEMA's data to kind of correlate, we do that with the storm surge. But for instance, we don't use FEMA rainfall data. We use National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration rainfall data because it's a different evaluation that FEMA looks at. They're mostly focused on storm surge and inland. They're looking at elevations and rainfalls for 100-year, 500-year rainfall events for the most part. So I guess the bottom line is the purpose of the programs and the studies is somewhat different. The other thing is that, FEMA is looking at property elevation and storm event information. We are required to look at assets. We're required to look at buildings and roads and stormwater structures and shorelines and different types of things. So the scope of what we have to look at versus the scope of what FEMA looks at are different because it's 2 different purposes.
And to expand there a little bit more, I'd say for the layman, it would be the difference between like engineering and planning grade. This is supposed to, at the planning grade level, it's supposed to be a broad brush of what is available. So you can kind of drill into the areas that are identified in this study and kind of enhance and gather more data to make that closer to that engineering level. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we will stick around for a few minutes if anybody else has any questions.
It may be on Zoom. Frank, we'll get Frank in on this. Frank, is there anyone that maybe willing to ask or wants to ask questions on Zoom? They can raise their hands now.
At this time, we don't have anybody, but let's
Okay.
give them an opportunity to raise their hands.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think that wraps up our meeting. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Those were great questions and great comments. We appreciate it. And all this will be made publicly available. The meeting will be on our website. We'll get all the reports and all the maps available on our website as soon as we're done. Thank you.
Thank you.